So we started out with our three theories of comedy, and now we're going to push one of them a little bit further and see if we can explain it a little bit more. And that's the idea of incongruency. So the thing is, not everything that's incongruent is funny. There is more to just putting random things together to, it turns out, make the incongruent funny, or the absurd as a combination of things that don't seem to fit together funny. So one of the earliest theorists of comedy is Henri Bergson, and Bergson's whole theory really is about we laugh when we observe a living creature acting like a machine, when a human being operates mechanically, when they can't stop themselves, when they cross the boundary, that is, between being a living being and just being a machine. And what he says is going on there is that there is this incongruency. On the one hand, a human being supposedly has free will, but when we see them acting like a machine, they're being mindless, they're being repetitive, that creates an incongruency. They should know better. They shouldn't be acting like this. So Bergson said that this can explain a lot of different things that we see that are funny. And he also says that this has something to do, it's a kind of psychic relief that has to do with our notion of, well, do we have free will or not, the responsibilities that we have to exercise that free will, and the reality of operating or slipping into just the mechanics of going about our life in a way where we can't operate or use our free will, and we just become mindless and repeat things that it doesn't seem like we should be doing. If people act like machines, that can be funny because we should know better. That isn't the way people should be. All right, so the other very brief reading we have that kind of touches on this idea of absurdity is by Jerry Palmer, The Logic of the Absurd. So what you can see here is that he is trying to understand, to figure out the logic of the absurd. What is the formula, in other words, that creates absurd humor? So he is talking about, he uses the term the gag, and he's going back and he's looking at early comedy and trying to understand the gag. What are the different portions, the different components of the gag that make something absurd that we see funny? And what he says is that we have to have two different stages. One is the peripeteia. That is the surprise that the narrative constructs for us. That is the construction through narrative of some event which is surprising. And the example that he uses, I've taken a few frame grabs of the actual example for you to see, is from this Laurel and Hardy movie where they are up in the top of a skyscraper and they are taking an elevator down, and as they're doing it, this I guess he's like a policeman of some kind, or he's got a uniform anyway, official uniform one. He steps underneath the shaft because stuff is falling down. He's trying to protect himself, and he gets squished by Laurel and Hardy. So you can see in these images here, squished there, but there he is. He crawls out and he's really short now. Okay, so the absurdity here, according to Palmer, and the way this works as humor, is that you have this surprise where a guy gets squished, but what happens is there's this absurdity of him stepping out and being shorter, right? And what Palmer says is there has to be this pair of syllogisms, these statements about the surprise that you've seen. And on the one hand, that process that you've seen has to be implausible. This doesn't fit. This is incongruous. He, in this case, survives being squished by an elevator. That is illogical. That is absurd. However, he says, Palmer, there's a pair of them, and the other one is that process has a small measure of plausibility. And it's that small measure of plausibility that makes it comedy, that makes it funny. So we know that to be squished also means to be made smaller And so what we're seeing is that he's been made smaller. So still, of course, that's less plausible than the overarching implausibility that you would live through this. But that little glimmer of plausibility is what makes it funny. The balance between the plausibility and the implausibility makes it comic surprise versus, horror. So, for example, if this was just him getting squished, right, and he didn't come out, well, that would be a horrific ending. But the fact that he has become short and he walks out, that's absurd humor. But we couldn't have it if there wasn't this little bit of plausibility to it, which is related to what it means to be squished. This sounds very silly, and that's appropriate. We're studying comedy, but I think you can see here that you can look for the logic and start to understand what is incongruency. How is incongruency working? How is it not about just sheer randomness? And my challenge for you now is, as we look at different films or other comedy bits that seem to have this kind of absurd incongruency, where can we find that little measure of plausibility? What is it that explains how this comes about and why it's funny?